Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, July 29th, 2024, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. And as always, before we dive into this week's episode, I do want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, this show on our 10th year is and will always be 100% free to download as long as I am able to keep producing it with the incredible support of my producer, Noelle Dilworth, and the editing team of Pro Podcast Solutions. And, you know, it's not free. We try and keep it cheap, but it's not free. So I do want to thank those of you who help us financially so that we can keep on making episodes for you. The best way to do that is to visit patreon.com. That's patreon.com/talknerdy. And you can pledge like as little as $1 an episode. It goes a really long way. This week's top patrons include Anu Bharavaj, Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Rika Maharaj, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Pasquale Gelati, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so much. All right. So this week I had the pleasure of chatting with Dr. Daisy Dunn. She is a classicist who has actually written 7 books and also for a lot of popular outlets as well. Her newest book is called The Missing Thread, A Women's History of the Ancient World. It's fascinating. If you don't know what a classicist is, that's okay. We are going to get into it. I didn't either. We're going to get into it. She's going to help us understand throughout the episode. You may have also seen Daisy on television, perhaps on BBC, Channel 5, Sky, Netflix, or Discovery, maybe even BBC Ideas. Or you may have heard her on BBC Radio 4, The World Service, Times Radio, or several more outlets. So I guess without any further ado, let's learn a little bit something. Let's learn a little bit about a women's history of the ancient world with her new book, The Missing Thread. Here she is, Dr. Daisy Dunn. Well, Daisy, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So I'm very excited to talk about your newest book. It's called The Missing Thread, A Women's History of the Ancient World. This is obviously a topic that is probably talked about more in academic circles than I'm aware of, but definitely not talked about very often in the public discourse, or at least has not historically been. And so I'm very excited to learn some new things from you. Before we get into the actual book, I'd love to learn a little bit more about you and your kind of academic path. So you are a classicist. What does that mean? Does that mean that you study classic literature, that you study history or certain classical periods? What is a classicist?
So a classicist is essentially a specialist in the ancient world, specifically the ancient world of Greece and Rome and their empires and sort of environs. But I mean, I get this a lot. I say to people, I'm a classicist, and people's gut reaction usually is like, oh, so you study Jane Austen? Or like, what do you do for a living? And I think actually, yeah, you kind of think of, I don't know, the Penguin classics, or, you know, reading the classics kind of means something different these days. But sort of classics is actually a really, really old course. And I studied it at Oxford initially, and that course basically just hasn't changed in hundreds of years. You're studying the same Greek and Latin texts. You're looking at sort of everyone from Homer through to Cicero, the Latin love poets, looking at the ancient world and trying to understand ancient cultures through the language. So I learned Latin and I learned ancient Greek. So all the material I work with today as an author is written in those languages. So that was kind of like the long part of my training, was really getting as kind of fluid as I could in reading those languages. I don't speak them. No one really speaks Latin and ancient Greek today. They are languages that you read. So I was at Oxford doing that. And then I did a graduate course, a master's in the history of art, which was a slightly different direction to go in, but I was specializing in the Renaissance and particularly in Italy because I was really interested to see what people made of the classical world when they rediscovered it. And I thought this would be a really interesting angle to look at the same material, but sort of through the eyes of people who are really engaging with it closely. So I spent a year at the Courtauld in London, immersing myself in Italian Renaissance art, which was lovely. And then I did my PhD, my doctorate in classics, and became a writer after that. So it's quite a long training. I think I was at university for about 9 years in total.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, People say, "Oh, Daisy, you could have become like a doctor. You could have become like a consultant, a surgeon, or something in that time." And I think, well, yeah, that's true. But I really love what I do, and I kind of find it quite a privilege to be able to access this material, which is so ancient. I'm handling stuff which is thousands of years old, and getting to know people who lived thousands of years ago, and that's always felt very special to me.
Oh, it's fascinating. So you get to read these original texts and then sort of, you're not translating them, but you are, what would you call it? Like, I mean, interpreting, sharing, funneling. I don't know. Like, there's probably so many different words. Are you doing like hermeneutical research?
So I think it's a mixture of all of the above. So on a
Mm-hmm.
typical day, I'll sit there and I'll read a text or part of a text in Latin or Greek, and then I'll write something about it. And a lot of it is quite close work. So people were quite fond of sort of wordplay, just as we are today. When you read a lot of these writers, they were quite playful, and they could be quite subversive, and they're often using language in quite an interesting way. So you get quite a good insight into their psyche and their personality by looking at how they use language. So that's why it's really fundamental that you understand those languages, so you get the nuance, you get kind of where they're coming from. Sometimes I am translating. I'll translate what they said as accurately as I can in order to try and capture their voice, because I mean, so few people read Latin and Greek now. They're very sort of niche subjects. They're not widely taught in schools. But I am always like a strong believer that anyone should be able to enjoy this work. And even though it's there in Greek and Latin, I think it's really important, if you know those languages, to be able to translate them and to render those texts so that they're approachable for everybody to read.
Oh, it's fascinating. And you've written several books. I'm curious about the evolution of the topics. Is it that you are digging deep into archives and into libraries and you just stumble upon something that captures your attention and you want to get deeper into it? Like, how do you choose what you um what you really kind of focus in on and dedicate more time to?
I sometimes ask myself the same question, particularly when I'm sort of just finished a book and I've got to start a new one, and I think, oh gosh, I've got to find a new idea. What do I do? But 9 times out of 10, it comes to me, and often through serendipity. My first book I wrote on the love poet Catullus, who was living in the first century BC, and he wrote in just the most kind of passionate, open, explicit, earthy, Scraber's kind of way. He was very, very sort of lively as a poet, and he was sort of my first love. So I was kind of led to him through sort of my passion for his work. For other books, I've just sort of drawn on things that have happened to sort of grab me at the time when I didn't have a book to write already. So I wrote on the eruption of Vesuvius, the catastrophic one which buried Pompeii in AD 79, because I visited there as a child and I'd revisited since, and I'd just always been completely captivated by the casts of the human victims that they managed to create from the ground. And it just struck me as so strange that you have all these casts of people, but you don't know the identities of any of them. But what you do have is a collection of letters and an encyclopedia by an uncle and a nephew who were caught up in that eruption. So I just thought, wouldn't it be interesting to write a book about that disaster, but from the perspective of two men who experienced it? One of them died, the uncle died, but the nephew, Pliny the Younger, survived to tell the tale. So that became a kind of basis for a dual biography. So that was a book that really kind of married archaeology and science and sort of, looking at volcanoes. Something like volcanology is not my specialist topic. But I had to sort of get into reading about some of that in order to understand exactly what was going on, and then write that as a biography. And then another book I did was just a complete chance. This one actually hasn't been published yet in the States, but it came out here in 2022, and it's called Not Far from Brideshead. And this is a book which seems quite unusual considering the previous titles I'd written, because it's not overtly classical. It was about Oxford University between the First and the Second World War. The protagonists of that account are people who were teaching classics within the university. So I still see it as a classicist book, but the idea for that came because I was on book tour publicising my Catullus book. I was invited up to North Yorkshire in the north of England to give a talk. And while I was there, I happened to visit Castle Howard, which is this amazing English stately home, which I'd seen featured in like various period dramas and things on TV. And it was the setting for this 1980s series of Brideshead Revisited, this adaptation of Evelyn Waugh's novel. And I walked into this amazing house, looked at the hall, and the hall was full of classical art. It was full of these busts of gods. It was full of paintings inspired by Ovid's Metamorphoses. It seemed so sort of rich in classical material. So I started Googling on my phone. I think I must have written in something like classics and Castle Howard. And what came up was the name of a classical scholar, Gilbert Murray, whose name doesn't mean a lot to many people unless you've studied classics, but he was a great titan of kind of Victorian classical scholarship. And what I learned is that he had married into the family that inhabited Castle Howard. And that just struck me as amazing because I'd read all of his books as a student. His name was always on my reading lists. But I thought, isn't it such a shame? Like, as students, we never think to look up the lives of the people whose books we're told to read. But he lived this amazing life. And I got into sort of his trajectory of his career and his retirement from Oxford. And basically this kind of war broke out over who should succeed him as the most senior professor of Greek. And it was just this really kind of fun time in the 1920s where you've got the roaring 20s, you've got all the parties, you've got this kind of liberation from the First World War. But you've also got this sense of foreboding of the war that's still on the horizon, the Second World War. And I just wanted to kind of capture that fleeting window through Gilbert Murray and his circle. So again, it was complete serendipity. So for an author, I think that's always my advice to people. When you don't know what to write about, you just kind of have to wait and see where life takes you. And sometimes it's to the most interesting, unexpected places as a writer.
Right. And I mean, I think that's a great segue into this newest book where you're really putting women in the center stage, women who very often were, I don't want to say forgotten per se, but women who were not elevated, women whose voices were not amplified, or women who were very often spoken about as objects instead of as subjects. And I'm curious how you chose. I mean, you are a woman, I am a woman. This is fundamentally interesting to me. This is our history, and it's the history that's not often told, but it's always been half-half, right? Even though most of the shit we've read from most of human history was written by men about men. Like, it was always half-half. So how did you decide, or is this something that's always been brewing in the back of your mind? Did you go into this like with a feminist or a political angle, or what was before we get into the content, what was some of the meta thoughts as you were putting this together?
Well, like you, I'd always been annoyed at how little we hear about women from history. I mean, as you say, there's just so much emphasis. I think particularly in a subject that's quite traditional, like classics, you've got these grand narratives of war and empire building, and the stories of Alexander the Great and the achievements of Pericles in creating Athenian democracy, and all really important stuff. But I was really aware, particularly as a student, that I felt I just wasn't getting the full picture. You might have a module on women, or that would be sort of like 1 week out of the term where you're doing sort of like women and others, or like women and slaves, as if that's just kind of one homogenous group. It would be like that. And particularly, back in my school days, it was seems to be always be like that. If you go back to the 90s, that is kind of what you encountered. And I always thought there was something more to say. And I think I was particularly surprised by the fact that in recent years there's been this huge resurgence of interest in mythology, in Greek mythology. So you get a lot of retellings of women from myth. In particular, there are these novels which have been written. If you go into a bookshop today, you'll find a load of novels which are inspired by ancient Greek myth. And that's great, but these are not real women who existed.
Right.
And I just still had this burning question, well, what were the women doing for all of this time? You know, I'm reading all these histories of the Persian Wars, of the Peloponnesian Wars, all these events which shaped the course of ancient history. But I didn't know what women were really up to. And I'd heard of, you know, a decent number. As a classicist, obviously you come across a decent number of women. But it was only when I started researching this book that I realized how many women I hadn't heard of. And I was actually quite shocked by that.
Yeah, so I'm curious, maybe I should throw this out there when I think about these periods of history. And it's funny because I'm not somebody who thinks about these periods of history as often well, definitely not as often as you do, but I don't even know if as often as your everyday person does. When I think about representation of women historically, and probably not even thousands, like thousands is a plural of years ago, but even just hundreds of years ago, I think of women as homemaker. I think of women as basically slave, right? Or like whether it be like chattel slavery, like women as mothers, women as objects of sexual desire. I think that there are these like archetypes and these representations, or you'll hear these sort of heroic war type stories where it's a woman pretending to be a man, or a very aberrant woman who has like these special powers or these special skills. And of course, there's that whole other trope of like women as the I don't know, the source of some man's downfall. You hear those stories a lot as well. And so I'm curious, as you started to dig in, because you're looking at actual history, but that actual history is so tied up in myth and literary, I guess, exaggeration. So as you're digging into these texts, what kinds of like roles, or what kinds of descriptions of women are you not starting to, but have you stumbled upon throughout your career?
Well, a lot of the tropes that you mention are very present in
Mm-hmm.
the ancient sources. So you do come across the idea of the ideal woman in most of these ancient cultures I'm writing about was the homemaker. It was someone particularly who was good with wool, someone who was good at weaving. In sort of epitaphs and things, you know, in sort of grave inscriptions, you find a lot of praise for women who were good at weaving, who were good at looking after the children, who were sort of calm, steadying presences in the lives of men in tumultuous times. That's sort of seen as a great virtue. And you get Latin words in particular, which are recycled again and again and again as kind of ideal phrases in which to describe women. So things like pietas, which broadly translates as piety, but it meant something more than that. It's a religious feeling, but it's a kind of not an obligation, but a sense of doing your duty. So it had a broader ramifications. Words like castitas, which meant chastity. And again, that didn't mean chastity in our sense of the word. It didn't mean abstaining from sex altogether. It just meant having eyes only for your husband and sleeping solely with him and not thinking about any other man for the rest of your life. You know, it was a sense of loyalty, of really sort of not putting yourself first, you know, putting everyone else above you. These are kind of the tropes that you find sort of recycled, and you find a lot of women being written about and praised because they conform to those words.
So not a lot has changed, you're saying.
I'm saying not a lot has changed. Not a lot has changed. You know, again, so you get these sort of, as you said, these kind of aberrant women who overstep the boundaries of what's expected of them. And sometimes they are seen as phenomena. So they attract a lot of writing because they're seen to be doing something so different, so daring, so kind of unexpected that men think, oh, we better, actually there's something quite interesting about her, we'll write this down. Whether it's sort of positive or negative, it's often both, that people sort of look at certain women who waded into military matters, for example, with a certain amount of reverence, but also you get phrases like, well, there was nothing left for the generals to do when the women were doing this. So you get a real sort of mixture, and you can kind of, at one point, I remember reading this particular text by Livy, who's this historian of Rome, who was very, very sort of respected in the ancient world. He wrote this long work from the foundation of the city onwards. And if you describe women doing something that wasn't expected of them, like wading into battle for some reason, he described them in such a way as if they're sort of like aliens, find themselves in a completely different world. It would just, you can tell from the way that he was writing that this is just, he's not exactly comfortable or easy with the state of affairs, even if he's amazed by it. So you can really pick up sort of how men were feeling about women from the way that they wrote about them doing these various things. So I found I just had to keep reading and rereading and rereading. And I was using a lot of judgment a lot of the time. You read things, there are so many descriptions which defy belief. And it's up to you as a modern historian to decide what you think the truth is. Because a lot, when you're dealing with a material which is 2,000 years old or older, you're not going to find definitive answers a lot of the time. You can't prove that something happened or something didn't happen. But what you can do is to draw on your expertise. You draw on your years of experience of being exposed to this material, and you become familiar with things which are rehearsed again and again and again, and are therefore perhaps unlikely to be true. They're sort of used to characterize people. So you can kind of dismiss things. And then you come across things which seem incredibly unusual, and they have a kind of ring of truth about them. So to pick a completely arbitrary example, Emperor Nero famously or infamously killed his mother. And there's a particular description in this passage in the historian Tacitus, where it said that Nero weighed down this canopy. She was on a boat at the time. He weighed down the canopy above her so that it would collapse and crush her to death. So that was the plan. But it said that she was saved from being crushed because she was sitting on this particular kind of couch. And the couch had these sort of armrests at the side, and the armrests were just high enough that then when the ceiling caved in, they stopped her from being crushed because they prevented the crush. And I just think, well, that's such an intricate bit of detail that just seems to be like quite accurate. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's something slightly odd and weird. It's very specific to outline.
It's not, and it's not fantastic. It's actually kind of mundane.
It is, exactly.
It's like specific and mundane. Like, nobody would make that up.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's the kind of clue that you're looking for. That's something you'll come across and you think, okay, so she managed to escape that assassination attempt. She swam to shore and then she was bludgeoned to death, stabbed to death after that. But, that particular attempt failed. And I believe that attempt was made because of this detail. So it is just all about making judgment on material. And you can only make that judgment when you've kind of acquired enough experience through familiarity with the material.
Yeah, and I can imagine, there's something you mentioned previously that I wanted to circle back to, that when very often you're reading about women through the lens of men, that although you are learning something about women, you're probably learning a hell of a lot more about men and about their egos and about their desires. And like when you were, I think especially when you mentioned that thing, well, like now what's left for the generals to do? It's like the fragility of the male ego that you're reading even 2,000 years ago. It must be so interesting to have a modern eye roll or a modern reaction to something so ancient and say like, wow, that is like just has persisted for so long.
Exactly. Oh my gosh, so much of that. I sat there with an eye roll all the time.
It's just incredible.
It is. And I think, I mean, men vary, like as they do today. You certainly come across men who are more sympathetic to women. They seem to sort of see them in maybe not quite 3 dimensions, but more than 2 dimensions, which is what you get in so many of the texts. You get these very kind of hardcore traditionalists who are writing, and you know that they don't have any patience with women doing anything that could earn them any kind of renown, you know. Um, on the other hand, you get these kind of more sensitive souls. And this is why I particularly love poetry in the ancient world, because the men who were poets, they could be really brutal and ruthless in the ways they wrote about women, but they could also be incredibly emotional and try to at least understand what was going through a woman's head. A lot of the time they got that wrong, but they were making an effort. And so you get these quite impassioned accounts of women, and even if they're misfiring slightly, I think the fact that they're making an effort and their interpretation of what a woman is thinking at that time can be quite interesting. So in my first book, Catullus, he had this love affair with this married woman he wrote about called Lesbia. And he wrote these love poems for her, which are absolutely beautiful. And he praised her to the skies and was completely enthralled to her. But then the relationship soured and he accused her of having an affair with his friend, and then turned really, really nasty and accused her of servicing, shall we say, queues of men at crossroads, of being, you know, just completely morally corrupt and horrendous. But then when he actually tries to like put her voice down on the page, and there are things you think, this is so clever, you're actually hearing what seems to be something a woman might have said. So he looks back on their relationship, and he says, so at one point she said to me, what a woman says to a man in the moment ought to be written on the wind or running water. And I think, oh wow, you know, that does sound like something that a woman might say to a lover who was, you know, it's sensitive. And even if that wasn't actually, you know, a direct paraphrase of what she said, it shows some consideration of, you know, a woman trying to temper a man who's there demanding so much of her, you know, saying that women can be changeable, they can change their mind. You know, it just seems very modern. And I think this is the thing, it's really interesting just to read the breadth of different type of source material, because when you come across the poets, you come across the playwrights, you're often much more likely to find a slightly more nuanced portrayal of women than you find in some of the traditional history books, for example.
Oh, yeah, and that doesn't surprise me at all, and I think it's one of those constant reminders, and I wonder, you're confronted with this so often that it may not even necessitate making it explicit. But as somebody who comes from, so I'm a psychologist now, but I came from the neurosciences, and I've done a lot of public science communication for the past I don't know, 10, 15 years. And I think that there's a tendency to think about ancient peoples as if they are less human, as if they were somehow
Mm.
less evolved. And like, we are the same species as these
Yeah,
people. We have the same brains, the same capability. We just had like less technology. You know what I mean?
yeah,
You
yeah.
know, there were a few things we didn't really understand about the universe, but love and passion and jealousy and confusion and why am I here and where am I going and all the big questions of meaning and purpose and fear of death and loneliness, and those are all been there for thousands of years.
That is so true. This is completely the case. And this is, I think, why I'm drawn to this kind of material in particular, because you recognize yourself, you see a reflection of what you felt in your life, what you're feeling maybe at that very day, that very moment that you're reading the text, you see it reflected back to you from 2000 years ago. And that's why it's so exciting for me. But I think exactly this, what you say, there's this tendency to almost oversimplify people who were living 2000 years ago. I think when you're looking at Romans in particular, you think, oh, they're all really into blood sports, they're into gladiators, they're into sort of throwing each other to the lions. They were quite basic. And I'd say there are sort of elements of their culture which we would characterize in that way. They weren't squeamish to the same degree as we were. All through history, you've got so many later periods as well where people would watch public executions. This was just something that humans did, and we can frown upon that today and think, oh, we've moved on so much. But there are other areas where, they'd probably look at us in the same way and think, how could we be so churlish in that respect? They'd probably be completely bewildered by us spending all of our time on machines and feeding things into Twitter or X, our opinions, rather than writing like a great chronicle of something. Like, why bother throwing out your opinions for free when you could actually live on and produce something lasting? I mean, there is all kinds of things that look at us and think in the same way. We've kind of haven't progressed at all. We've gone backwards.
Right.
But I think this was a frustration, I think, particularly for writing about women. It's this very reductive way in which women have been written about historically. And I was trying so hard to challenge this and to try and think about these women as human beings, as you say, because I think a lot of those source materials, even when thinking about someone like Cleopatra, who did so much, incredibly famous woman in the ancient world and today, but she's often presented as if she is just like some character in a play. You don't really get a sense of her motivation, of what she was feeling, like how a lot of things, she suffered a lot. She went through some very, very difficult passages in her life, but there's been very little attempt to understand how that might have felt and how that might have influenced her choices and her actions. So these were questions I had very much at the forefront of my mind when I was writing.
I love that because it's true. I feel like when we think about more, I guess, modern literary or like artistic or film or television depictions of ancient women, we're watching things that were produced very often through the male gaze. And so it's about how that woman is like some sort of succubus or some sort of, like how she is affecting the men around her, right? Like even when I think about Cleopatra, it's like how the men reacted to her strength or to her sexuality or to her. And it's like, that is not what she was concerning herself with.
Exactly.
Like she was running a nation.
I know, like they write about her even like, oh, so she met up this season, she put on lots of makeup as if this was like a ploy that she was there for. Like,
and it's like, so did every king. Like she was a king. She was a king, and just like all the male kings, they wore a shitload of makeup.
Exactly. I love that. And when I was writing for that, I sort of drew on this passage in the poet Ovid, because he was saying, oh, women, they are such deceivers. They don't even let us men see their true faces. They cover it all up with makeup, and it's basically this great grand deception they do just to trick us.
Oh, jeez.
And that was the view, that it's all done to influence men.
It's still the view.
Yeah, exactly.
It's so insane. I'm so curious then, like, you're doing all of this incredibly impressive research and you're seeing all of these representations of women in these ancient texts. How often are you coming across a representation by a woman? Like, is it exceedingly rare to find original text by the hand of a woman?
Depressingly rare.
Yeah. Okay.
We have sort of fragments from here and there. I mean, one of the amazing things, and it is little known and it should be much better known, is that the earliest named author in the entire world was a woman.
Wow.
And we do have some of her work. So she was a Sumerian woman. She was working in the 3rd millennium BC, and her father was the king of Akkad, which is an area which some people think was kind of near Baghdad. So we're talking about that kind of part of the world. And she worked she was a priestess, so she worked in a sort of temple, and she wrote these hymns and these poems. And we have her words, and they are so beautiful and they are so human, because one of them actually describes an enemy of her father was intent on overthrowing him and seizing power for himself. And he came and he raped her. And she actually wrote about this. She wrote about how she felt like her ability to sing her poetry had been taken away from her as a result of that. And you read that, and literally your heart beats a bit fast. You're reading these words by a woman describing something in such a way that you just totally understand, immediately understand, like all of those millennia in between just fall away, and you're kind of heart to heart with this woman.
Oh, it's incredible. And it's so true. Just because things might have been normalized at the time in certain forms of brutality and violence against women, as they are in parts, well, as they are to some extent across the globe even today, but like significantly more normalized then, doesn't mean that the actual individuals experiencing this were somehow simpletons, that they were somehow animalistic or less than. They were fully formed human beings with depth and feelings and empathy and fear, and they felt pain the same way that we do. Like, somebody getting raped in the year, what year was it when she was writing?
So it's the third millennium BC. It's different
Jeez.
places. Yeah.
Yeah, so someone getting, I mean, it's the same. Culturally, it's different, the pressures are different, the way you write about it is different. Well, maybe it's not different, but, like, it's
It's the
I
same.
think
Yeah.
any woman, yeah, could deeply empathize as they read those passages.
Completely. And this is why I just feel we should be reading so much more of I mean, the amount of work by women that survived is small. We have Sappho as well, wrote amazingly about emotion and about love and about sexual jealousy. It's very fragmentary, her work, but we still have it. We have bits of poetry by other women as well. When I was writing this book, I actually was really determined to bring out as many of these female voices that exist today as I could. So at the start of every chapter, I translate part of a woman's bit of writing. So a lot of the time that's poetry, so that we hear something of women's voices, which is so rare and so hard to find. And this is the really difficult thing to bear. We know that there were women writing history even, but none of their work has been preserved because it was men who were copying the works out to preserve them. And for whatever reason, they just didn't find these works worthy of being preserved, of being copied. So they
Well, and I
didn't
can imagine
survive.
that some of them probably it was probably even more than that. Yes, there were probably many for whom it was like, "Well, this isn't important, so we're not gonna copy it." And there were probably many for whom your history is heretical and I'm going to destroy this. I don't want people to read this. I mean, that I can't help but see things through this, like, patriarchal lens, and that, like, women gaining even, like, an ounce of power is, like, very threatening to patriarchal societies,
Very
and
threatening. Yeah. Sorry, yeah, no, I was just going to say, like, I think as a case in point, all you have to do is look at Greek tragedy, look at plays like Medea, look at these plays about sort of Clytemnestra murdering her husband. The theatre was the place where men presented to other men what would happen if women did have power, if they were operating. And they show these women to be murderous, and civilization essentially crumbles when these women take charge. So that is just a sort of a real manifestation of men's fear of women actually gaining any kind of autonomy or power.
ugh, it's so devastating to think how many people, how many incredible voices, how many insights, how much innovation, how much thought we could have today, but we don't because it was suppressed. Like, and I don't just mean like it wasn't copied or, people forgot about it. It was like actively suppressed.
Mm, yes, yes, no, completely. I think you're relying today on the value judgments that were made hundreds, thousands of years ago, and that limits your ability today. So I think this is why this book was so important for me to pursue. I just thought I've got to make the most and mine those sources that we do have for as much as I could possibly find. Find the women who are hidden in those sources. Sometimes there's just a throwaway reference to a woman, but there's something, and I just kind of felt like I just wanted to find these women. I felt like it was something I felt like I needed to do, because it just didn't feel right to me. I've always been uneasy with the fact that we speak of the past through men. You know, we define it by the passages where this king was ruling, or where this war was waged by this military leader, or whatever else. But the contributions of women within that narrative just isn't really talked about. And it's amazing how quickly sort of one version of history just becomes canonical. You know, someone picks out what they think are the salient points on the historical map. They write that up into a narrative. And then more and more people just kind of draw back to that narrative and the offshoots of that narrative. And the same versions are just perpetuated, you know, all the way down time. So this is why it's so important to me to go back to the very beginning, go back to the primary sources. You know, where were the women? Let's just see, what were they doing during this war? Did they play a part in it? And a lot of the time, women were doing a lot. They were, you know, making so many sacrifices, personal sacrifices, in order to help men to achieve what they wanted. They had no political voice a lot of the time. They had no choice, but they willingly gave up their riches in the Punic Wars, which were fought between Rome and Carthage, for example. They did a hell of a lot. So I just felt like it was an important kind of modern service to those women to draw them out of the narrative and to show what they were doing.
Absolutely. I mean, it goes so far, I think, beyond the scholarship, and it really is like a social justice issue to be. And honestly, like, I have to be honest, sitting here talking to you, like, I'm angry that when I was learning in school, I didn't study classics by the time I was at university. I had shifted deeply into the sciences, but like, why wasn't I learning about any of these voices when I was a young girl in school? Like, why are none of these characters canonical? Why is this not something, you were talking about the first person who ever, or the first, I guess, surviving writer who wrote was a woman, and I'd never even heard of her. Why? I mean, it's kind of infuriating, if I'm being honest.
It's completely infuriating. And this is what I said to myself when I set out to write this book. I said, one of my aims is to make household names of more women from the ancient
Yeah.
world. Because it just isn't right that we think ancient, we think Julius Caesar, we think Alexander the Great, we think Nero. It isn't right that that is how we define thousands of years of history. You know, we need to be able to talk about women beyond Cleopatra. Cleopatra obviously deserves a place in that roll call, but so does so many other women. So Enheduanna, the earliest named author you mentioned, her name absolutely needs to be a household name. So I'm on a mission. I'm very much on a mission.
I love that, and I have to say, there's a little bit of an envy in like the incredible work that you put in to be able to do this kind of scholarship, to position yourself, to be able to read these, primary sources. I don't have much exposure to that, but the thing that comes up for me over and over in my mind was a very special course I took, actually not until I was working on my PhD. I took a history and systems of psychology course, which is a very standard, anybody listening to this who studied psychology, even at the undergraduate level, you took a history and systems course. And history and systems is always, what are all the different, first we had the Jung or the Freudian stuff, and then this came, and then this person did this. And very often there's like a handful of women, but it's mostly white men. And you kind of learn about it through different authors. But when I took this course at my PhD level, the textbook that this incredible professor chose, he was a psychologist who also had a philosophy background. It was a textbook in which you were reading primary sources, like the chapter about Darwin. The first section of the chapter was one of Darwin's writings, and then the second chapter was a historian talking about the writing. Like it was reading something that Freud had actually published, and then reading somebody talking about Freud. And I think so often when we study history, we skip to the person talking about the thing,
Yes, yes, yeah,
and we
yeah.
don't actually get to read the words of the person. And I don't know if it's because we assume, and yes, translation does change things a little bit, but that's why you read multiple translations and you see how different authors, you know, looked at it differently. But do we just assume that students aren't intelligent enough to read the words of these original people? Because I'll tell you what, when I read Darwin for the first time back in undergrad, I was like, this guy's a racist asshole. And I didn't ever think of him that way until I read his words coming from his mouth. Because the way people talk about him, he's perfect and could do no wrong.
It's astonishing, isn't it? And I think this is a really sobering lesson. I think that you lose so much just by having things filtered through to you through someone else's viewpoint. I say this, that might sound ironic. I'm an author who's presenting primary sources in this book.
But you get to read the primary sources. Like you have that, yeah.
And I've quoted them throughout. I quote. I'm a heavy quoter because I believe in putting across as much of that original material so you can read it, for yourself as possible. Notes in the back for those who want to read it in Latin and Greek. They can look it up, find the passage.
That's incredible.
I've done that that to help with that whole process. But I think do you think as students sometimes there's a certain kind of, not laziness necessarily, but we're rushed for time.
Yes,
and
100%.
Sometimes we think, okay, I'm just going to read the Précide account by some scholar that I trust, and that will give me everything I need, and I can go into class and I can talk about it.
Right, it's the Cliff's Notes. Yeah.
It's the Cliff's Notes version. Yeah. Rather than reading the actual text. But I think this is such a misconception, because as you say, often when you read the primary text, you get the more visceral reaction. You understand where they're coming from. And that's lost when you're just reading this kind of summary of what was said.
Absolutely. And I think even reading multiple translations of it, you've probably practiced this so much because this is, central to your field. But I remember taking an English class in high school and we were learning about existentialism. I had a very cool English teacher this year. And we were reading Crime and Punishment, and they, there were certain copies of the book that were given out, but it was also encouraged to go get yourself a copy. And I remember sitting in class and people were reading passages and I was like, geez, my book is wildly different than this person's book. And recognizing that they were just translations by very, very different scholars. And one of them was written in the most poetic way, and the word choice was just very drippy and ooey gooey. And the other one was the sort of starkest, most Russian thing you could possibly imagine. It was no detail whatsoever. And it was a different read. And it was so incredible to me that there were even portions, and this with biblical scholarship and stuff, where you're that's not what that word means. Well, it could mean this if you interpret it in this way. You're wow, it's fascinating. It changes the meaning.
It's so true. And translation as an art form, it's just changed so much down the century. So I a little while ago, I published a book. I was the editor of a collection. It's called Of Gods and Men. And basically I got 100 stories from the ancient world, and each of the 100 was translated by someone different through history. So people who were translating in the 16th century, there's even something by Queen Elizabeth I was a great translator of Latin, it turns out. So I got her translation of something, and then a translation that was published 2 or 3 years earlier. So a whole range of different styles, some in verse, some in prose, some very direct, like you say, others a lot more kind of florid, and there's a real kind of Victoriana kind of feel to a lot of these translations. And I think part of the fun of that exercise was seeing exactly that, how differently people interpret other texts and how much of their own time they pour into it.
Yeah. And how much of them they leave behind on the page, I think, too, which is something that it's almost like you don't want it to be true, because you're thinking, no, this is a clean and scholarly, it's just taking it from that language and putting it into mine. And it's yeah, but they had to interpret it to do that. Interpretation is not a direct translation. This is not an AI. And if it were, we all know what that looks like when you put something into Google Translate. It doesn't make sense anymore.
Exactly. It is highly problematic, and I'm always really aware of this because I am kind of the conduit,
right,
between these ancient languages and my sort of reading public and trying to. But I kind of, for me, it's always been the desire to share this material, which couldn't otherwise be read by, over 90% of people, that's always trumped any kind of anxiety I've had. It's just really important to me that people should have access to this material. And I just have to be sort of honest with myself and I translate everything that I do in my own books myself. So all the Greek and Latin I do myself. And that takes up quite a lot of the time of actually writing the book, because I'm moving, particularly with this book, there are hundreds of different texts and they all have their different style. So I was having to get into the head of each person I was translating and to try and put across honestly what they were saying, and choosing the right word, choosing the right tone for each of those when you're dealing with hundreds of different people is very, very difficult, but it is an incredibly important part of what you do as a classical historian. So I'm really keen on that. And I know there are a lot of classical historians who think this is just such a time-consuming business, and they will just use a pre-existing translation by someone else, and that's fine. That's absolutely fine. There are brilliant translations out there of lots and lots of classical works, but for me, it's part of my own education as well when I'm working on this material to really try and get inside the head of people. A really good way of doing that is to sit down with their text and to translate it.
And what an incredible exercise in empathy, what an incredible exercise in sort of self-reflection to notice when you are inserting your own reactions and your own thoughts and beliefs. And also then to be able to write a book like the one you did where you can offer that lens and you can offer that additional kind of interpretation, because so often when we are looking at the words of men, and the words of men are spoken in a way that has been normalized throughout human history, like I often talk about the patriarchy like it's the water. It's what everything's swimming in that we don't even recognize that it's there, and to have a voice that says, you know. Do you hear this guy? Like, do you hear what you just said? Like, can we take a second with that? Like, is sometimes what we need. But at the same time, it's that balance, right? Between being like, he said this, and then being like, you hear what he said? I think about, it's funny. I often do this with guests on the show, as I find these threads in my own mind, my own connections to the work or to the individual. And I am so influenced in my work as a psychologist by constructivism, meeting patients where they are and really, really working to take their frame. I'm somebody who is an atheist, but I treat people in end of life. And very often religion is an incredibly important component of their end of life experience. And my atheism is not important to their death story. And so taking the frame of somebody through their historical experiences, through their religion, through their whatever, you could point to a million different intersectional things. It's a fascinating and I think deeply humbling exercise that I get to do in my work. And I can't help but see a similarity. Like, you may be speaking to people who are long dead, but you are hearing their voices, amplifying their voices, and trying to take their frame as best as you can.
That's so beautiful. Yeah, completely. I always feel you do get to know someone on the page, even if they're not there sitting with you in the same room. If you're reading their words, you are as close as you can get to somebody who lived. You're really giving your time to try and to understand their viewpoint, to understand where they're coming from, to understand what was worrying them at the time they were writing this. And I think, with a historian's eye as well, you're looking at what's going on around them at that time, so you can understand what they're not saying. What they're not telling you is often as interesting as what they are telling you. Their omissions are actually very telling in themselves. And where I find I have to be most careful with this is when I'm writing about women sometimes and I feel really angry on their behalf. And there is this temptation to express that almost through them and to say they must be really furious at this moment because of what's happening. They must have really felt this injustice. But I sometimes have to then take a step back and think, actually, this is me when you were a woman living in some of these cultures, you wouldn't have seen any different a lot of the time. It might not have been as obvious to you that this was an injustice. This was the way that things were.
It was the water. Yeah, you were swimming in
Exactly.
it all the time.
Exactly. So for them, that was often really present. So you have to be quite careful as a historian. You can definitely say this was a gross injustice, but I think you have to be wary of saying she thought this was, or
Right.
she would have felt this was a gross injustice, because you don't know. You can't speak for how these women were feeling unless you have strong evidence to suggest that this was the case at that point. So it is incredibly interesting, and you want to say more than you can sometimes, but often, almost like in your job, you're someone who's listening
Right.
more than
Right. It's
someone
not
who's,
about me. It's
yeah,
about them. Yeah.
exactly.
And sometimes I do self-disclose in a therapy session, but I always have to ask myself, am I doing this in service to their therapy? Am I doing this because I think it will be beneficial or validating for them? Or am I doing it because I have some sort of, issue that I'm trying to unload? And if that's the case, I'm not going to do it.
No, that's amazing, isn't it? It's really really fascinating. I hadn't really thought about this parallel, but I think it's so there.
Right. It so is. And it's I've got to ask then because we're running low on time. I think as we wrap up, well, first I want to make sure if there's anything we haven't talked about that we do touch on it. So put a pin in that and be thinking if there's anything that you want to make sure that we touch on before we say goodbye. But the other thing that's sort of the big thing for me that I'm curious about is how has this work changed you? Like who are you for the work? How, what kinds of traits, what kinds of experiences, like how have you grown from this process?
I'd say that writing this book has made me more angry as a person.
Mhm.
It,
Mhm.
it's made me more aware of the limitations that women have endured, the obstacles that we're still having to face to try and overcome, and actually how similarly women have been written about through the ages. There is still a very reductive way, particularly in the press, that women are written about today, which seems very familiar when you read about women in the ancient world. This kind of unwillingness to think about women as humans we were discussing earlier. This, I think, it's made me much more aware of how I read about women in the modern world and how I would write about women going forward. It's also this sort of eagerness to notice the fact that the people who are written about the most often aren't the people who are most worthy of being written about the most.
Right.
The people who
Right.
are actually in the shadows are often a lot more interesting.
Absolutely. Oh, what a profound statement to sit with, this idea that there are so many stories that were untold, that there are so many discoveries that were unpublicized, that there were so many insights that none of us will have access to because those people weren't given their voices were not amplified. They weren't given space to share with us all of the gifts that they had to share. It's I think it is very, very humbling to think about it in that way. I'm curious, Daisy. I mentioned a second ago. Is there anything that you feel like you'd be remiss if we didn't sort of touch on? Anything that you want to make sure that the listeners know before we end the hour?
Well, only that women in the ancient world were incredibly important, no matter what you've read in the past about classics being a very traditional subject, looking at, Western civilization, whatever you want to say. It's not that. I've taken a very global approach to this book. I've gone beyond Greece and Rome. I've looked a lot at Asia Minor. I've looked at North Africa. I've looked at sort of different cultures and the way that they intersect and the way that ideas are spread. And I think for women's stories in particular, those connections are incredibly important to explore, to see sort of how stories developed, how people took influence from other women, even if they were living thousands of miles away. ideas spread, and ideas spread through travel. And to me, we're living in such a global age. I think that's a really important way to view the past as well.
Absolutely. Well, everybody, the book is The Missing Thread: A Women's History of the Ancient World by Dr. Daisy Dunn. Daisy, thank you so much for not just spending your time with us today, but God, spending so much of your time doing this incredible work so that we can all benefit from it.
Oh, thank you so much. It really is a pleasure to be able to talk about it now. I think I've been writing for so long, and writing is quite a solitary exercise. So this really is the fun bit for me. I get to go out and talk to everyone about it. So thanks so much for having me on.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear it. And everyone listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.